Not only that, you don't even look like the guy that did it. He does it to himself. He says, man, I said, wonder why you didn't act like Jesus Christ said, I wonder why this poor guy did this. He never did that before. You don't want to make it too obvious, obviously, but then you look like, the same. Okay. Main features of network split. Intelligence, direct reaction, penetration, isolation, these kinds of things in order to generate surprise and shock, conditions, stir philosophy, acceptance of gaps and risks. Let me explain that. You see it very often in our literature when it's translated gaps and risks. But when you look at what they're doing, it really isn't a gap. The gap's an avenue, and the risk is an opportunity. If you're letting a guy through, so you take the column apart. But now, if you're worried, if you're terrain-oriented or attrition-oriented, you want to hang on to the terrain, the gap is very real. If the guy comes through, you get all panic. But if you use the terrain as a medium for maneuver, then the gap doesn't assume all that importance. You use it for leverage. Echelon and depth. In fact, that's what happens. Some people have a little tactical reverse, right? They start to panic and make it even worse. You got to think, say, wait a minute, maybe that didn't work out tactically, but is that guy stepping in the bag in another direction? I can hold him from a different direction. Don't take him on another direction. Talked about that. Reserve. Matter of fact, you only want to use those people you have to. Once you start having success, only use the people you need in order to keep the operation going. Keep funneling everybody back in the reserves. Keep responsive. Because there's going to be a time, you're going to need that at some time to adjust to an unforeseen circumstance. And to give you an analogy or a counterpart, let's say if you're in a political thing, which suggests itself meeting in my mind, you might have an operation when you're succeeding. It might be a long campaign then. Don't reveal all your argument. Hold a lot of it back so that he tries to adjust and you can give him a huge counter adjustment because you save something back. We're done in reserves in terms of troops, ideas, and all that kind of stuff too. I don't want to save too much back for losing on my head, because I don't know how to do. But I'm saying where you have that opportunity, don't expend everything. Because in a sense, you tend to reveal yourself in terms of one thing. Okay, posture, positions, alternatives. We already talked about that. So, when you said it was a outblitz the blitz, in a sense, as I said, it's a reverse blitz. In fact, when we had ball here, it was very interesting. There was a meeting where they talked about the strong argument of offense and defense. And he's looking here, beady-eyed, can't figure out why they're getting all of them. He said, funny, he said, hey, there's no difference between offense and defense. It's just defense, you start late. They start to play. So what about the use of terrain? He said, nice, no difference. You use terrain on offense, and you use that defense, too. He said, if you start thinking the other way, you start becoming passive and make mistakes. Okay, drill and counter drill out campaign. Let's look at that and we'll look at counter drill. I want to bring these points to key points. Vanguards need constant support of people dependent upon unwanted ability from the grips of the crisis of its own mate. They really make their own crisis of regime. So the political party. Crisis and vanguard represent the marriage of instability and initiatives that create and expand the relative. So this thought naturally occurs. That thought occurs in order to dry up, one should strike at those causes that generate and exacerbate those crises.
Can you give an example?
Counter-guerrilla campaign. I want to look at this on the back and talk about this.
Who's that first guy? Mikhail?
Russian. Tukashevsky. Ramon Magsaysay. Let me let you read this and I'll comment on it. And it's not that difficult to understand. Sometimes it's quite difficult to implement. But here's where we normally have our props, these first two bullets. You also might want to read my star down here. I've been working the wrong side. These two are important. And that's what Max Stacy understood. In other words, these sort of let the others play. Very often we don't play this too. Instead, we're out here in the weeds just fighting all the time. You can't understand why we can't get there. These two are very important. He understood that. For example, in his counter-guerrilla campaign, he was a defenseman. So one of the things he did right away, he sent his commanders out in the weeds to try to flush the guerrillas in that. And once it did succeed, he fired them. And not only that, he used his propaganda, they're incompetent, and etc. Plus, he knew they were incompetent. So he just embellished it even more so to demonstrate to people he was serious and trying to get the government to get his act under control. Got rid of him. Then he put pressure on the president in order to sidetrack those politicians so they couldn't be in an important position, fire them if he could. And just he embellished the hell out of that with propaganda. Made them even look worse than they were. Well, these guys were going down the tubes. So once you start doing that, you start demonstrating by acts that you're serious about this, you want to change, then you can start infiltrating their movement, because now you start getting population on your side, you start penetrating inside their system. When you get inside their system, then you start playing these kinds of games rather than having them come to you. Recent example, Weinberger made a very serious mistake. He came off looking like an idiot. Remember this? He goes up there and defends that goddamn div act when it was a piece of junk. And eventually, he was forced to cave in. But he didn't get a lot of political leverage out of it because everybody knows he was forced to cave in. You know what the div act is, don't you? The Sergeant Clark, the air defense system. Now, I happen to be a little bit familiar with it because I know the real guys in the building that worked the problem. The junk, they knew it, they just played every game they could. They leaked it everywhere. And people kept the heat on. The Weinberger finally had to quit. In fact, there was one Marine Lieutenant Colonel who did a good job. Another point that Weinberger done. He should have trashed it earlier.
Did that Marine Lieutenant Colonel have access to Weinberger and tell him that it was a piece of junk?
No. Because the intervening layers wouldn't let him get access, which I'll come back to in a minute. It's very important. You're on to a very important point there. I'll come back to that later. Just hang on to that. It's a very important thing you're talking about. In other words, Weinberger was the emperor who has no clothes. And some people, in fact, Carter had the same problem. Jimmy Carter. I know a guy quit over to the White House because he wanted everything to go up right through the so-called command and staff line to the system. Well, that's guaranteed. The emperor has no clothes. You're gonna walk around naked all your life if that's the case. You've got to set up informal loops. And you better have those informal loops everywhere. I don't care whether you're down below or up top side. I'll cite my own case to illustrate that point. I was a major in the Air Force, working in the Pentagon, and I was talking directly to the Chief of Staff, and nobody in between knew it. I was part of an informal loop. I can talk about it now. I'm retired. And then how it happened one day was I was sitting in my office down there, I was doing some stuff on the FX, CF-15, and this exec came down who worked for Connell. And he told everybody else, he just out. He said, "Can I talk to you alone?" I said, "Yeah." You know who I am? Chief's got a problem. What's that got to do with me? He told me to come talk to you. Here's the information he gets. He said, "Write it." Oh. So how do we get the right information? Well, that's easy. I'll provide it, but he can't let on that he even has that information. But it'll give him a basis for asking questions so he can suck out the right information. You're going to have to protect loops. So, I said, here's what he's going to get. I said, here's what he should get. So when Carl was, he gets up here and says, rubbing his head, geez, be right. Can we take another look? Of course, he knows it's absolute ugly. And of course, that didn't take. So the guy said, "Nice, how do we get it to take?" I said, always a way to get it to take. Now, when you hold the next meeting with the chief, have the chief say, he's so bothered by this and upset, he complained a bit, that maybe we get an independent team in there to look at it to have a fresh view of it. Well, Christ, nobody wants their turf invaded. Guess what? They coughed out the right answer. You'll never get an independent team in there to take a look at it. read In Search of Excellence. And we talked about that informal. He didn't even understand what those informal communications really are. So I talked to IBM people, other people. You can't compromise. And I've been on the other end as a commander of a base the same way. Informal connection. I was getting information. I knew about it. I didn't let on know. I just did. Somehow I don't feel comfortable. Let's take another look at it. If they resisted me too much, they said, well, maybe we better send another team to look at it. You'd be surprised how quickly their views will change. Remember, if you have to look through a lot, each guy doesn't want to look bad above, particularly when you have a career mentality, worried about the next position up. I want to be sure that, boy, I don't look. Well, that means there's some bad information that's not getting there. He may need that may be the most important information. Another example, mine, I know my own, was I had a two-star general as a colonel. We didn't get along at all. In fact, he hated my guts. I did his too. But then his point is, and there were some reasons. But in any case, he said, "Can I talk to your people when you're not there?" I said, "Of course." He said, "I may ask you embarrassing questions." Ask me any question you want. I couldn't care less. I said, "You don't even have to tell me. Sneak in or anywhere." I couldn't care less. Or any, send any of your people, and I couldn't care less. We thought that was crazy. I trusted him. I didn't worry about this. They might even make a couple mistakes. So what? If I can't recover from a mistake, I shouldn't have a goddamn job. Very easy. I can understand. In other words, we had that common outcome. Of course, he didn't know I totally penetrated his organization. As a matter of fact, on the lightweight fighter, if you know the air staff system, what happens, you know how that works. The air staff system, the way that works, you have the pack panel and you have the two-star level of the, what they call it, I can't remember. Anyway, they have the pack panel is the major general level board to staff board or something. Then they have the air council, which is the three-star, the vice chief and chief of the guidance. When we were going to the lightweight fighter, we had that. We did it all by word of mouth. We had hardly anything down in writing except for money, and we had it totally obscured because there were a lot of generals who were trying to cancel out. And so we were doing all our design work over the phone, so they couldn't track. And they knew what was going on, but they couldn't find it. And we siphoned off monies from certain accounts. Of course, we had to deliver. But we had friends in place. In fact, that one four-star general told me he knew what I was doing. He says, publicly, I'm going to condemn this operation. He said, if you give it up, I'll kick you in the ass. So even some of them were on board, even though publicly they had to show a different face. And so what happened was they had a grade, such as air staff board. We would go through the air council and the air staff board, but then we get cleaned out the air council. So I was told that we penetrated the system. I said, okay, great, we'll go up to the air staff board and then we'll hook around the air council and give them information on the brief. In other words, we'll get it to the chief and some other people top side. The Schlesinger was on board too. So then we knew that, so we got the decisions set up such that they were made before the air council, above the air council. And then after the decision was made, then I was sent in as a briefer to inform them, and they thought it was going to be a briefing on how they were going to be able to deliberate upon the decision. I go in there and I say, oh, incidentally, this is information briefing only. The decision was made. We just want to show you why we made the decision. One of my God, they about died. They got a subordinate. It's more fun to take out a superior. Now, I don't advocate that. What I'm trying to say, we didn't take them out per se. Well, we had to get something done, and they were in the way. And we did have support to get us superior. So we totally penetrated their system. The reason why the people knew it was the right thing to do was they were making insane arguments for trying to keep some things they just didn't advocate. They had all these paradoxes, but what happened now? But of course, you don't see that way. So that's the kind of thing. So those things do go on. In fact, this Marine colonel, he had total support. A lot of support. They didn't realize. This guy's really cleaned up the debate. You've heard Denny's speech he made one of the others. Without this Marine lieutenant colonel, it would not have happened. But see, that thing could have been kill a long time. There's some other things. It's just the defending trash. They think it's embarrassing. It's wrong. See, like I tell people, you know, look at, let's say you lay out a theory, and you want to go ahead with it. You know, just because you have a theory, you look at some previous evidence, and that doesn't mean it's all right. You may have something. And so you really eventually have to test it in a hard world of hard knocks, or we call it test. And I think you've got to be prepared to be embarrassed by the results of the test. And if you're not prepared for that, you're wrong business. Because that's the whole idea, is to find those flaws. Not just make nothing wrong. You look like an idiot. You've got to be prepared to be embarrassed by the results of the test, or by the experiment. That's part of the game. And if you try to cover it up, and someone knows about it, they're going to use it to your displeasure at the moment you would least like them to use it. Like when you're most vulnerable. Yeah, we get rid of this guy. Over the side. I just can't emphasize that enough. Very important. In any case, let's get more pragmatic why that's important too. And I've already said it here. Importance and support for guerrilla work. Why? I just said it in my way. Then you can start looking inside their operation. Make them blind to your operation. Then you get leverage. Okay, let's take a 5-minute break. We'll come back over the categories. I want to give you a clue because that's won't take long to go through. I think so. Let's start with the category of conflict. And I'm going to phrase it a little differently, but I'll show you how I'll tie it back to moral militancy. And so we're really talking about 3 kinds of military viewpoint: attrition, maneuver, and moral. And all I've done here is laid out some salient examples. These are not exhaustive examples. You might have some in your own mind of which you can attribute to attrition, warfare, maneuver, conflict, or moral. I'll let you look at them, and I'll make some comments. You'll also notice that I juxtapose the Emperor Napoleon versus General Bonaparte. He's more toward attrition, Bonaparte more toward attrition. You'll also notice I stuck under maneuver also Patton and McCarthy. Patton primarily in a tactical sense, McCarthy more in a strategic. And of moral, of course, not only Mongols, but real leaders. A few good counter real leaders like Knight Sage play that very heavily. So with that in mind, let's look at each one of those: attrition, maneuver, and moral. We'll go in that order. First, attrition. Pardon? Well, he plays the moral game very heavily. Well, he plays a maneuver too, and they have some very emphasis on the moral game. First, that's what guerrilla warfare is. Great emphasis on the moral. Moral and maneuver. Okay? Attrition observation. Here's the key thing. Firepower is king. Everything else is subordinate. Protection. Trenches, armor is used to weaken or dilute the effects of enemy firepower. Mobility is either bring firepower to bear or evade enemy fire. And measures of success. How often have we seen it? Body count, targets destroyed. Notice the Pentagon. You always like to talk about how many bodies they pump out or targets destroyed. In fact, we have a term over in the Pentagon called target servicing. Well, when you're talking about that, that's an attrition mentality. Definite attrition mentality. Then you see this begin to take place. Seize and hold terrain objectives instead of going after the enemy's armies or his forces. The guy says, that's not true. I said, let me see your operational order right in here. Take this hill or take that terrain. And it's right there. Oh, we didn't need it. I said, take it out. That's why do you have it in there for if that's the case? Because you change that order. You say, you know, go and operate this sector, take out the force and neutralize the force that exists here. You have to take the hill, fine. If not, don't take it. Not only that, you've seen instances in the past where we've taken a hill, we spend a lot of blood, the next day we leave it. We kill all those guys and depart. But if the terrain were so valuable, why did we stay there? tend to fall apart. Okay, so these are the kind of things. Now with that in mind, let's lay out what I'd like to call the essence or picture of the attrition work there. And basically what you're doing, you're creating these kind of things. Destructive force, protection, mobility. So you're interplaying these, and here's your payoff. But you read it to a comment. And note this. Isn't this a noble aim? To tell enemy to surrender and sue for peace. What if they don't show up? That's very noble. That's nice, but if they don't show up, it doesn't take. What do you get out of that image or picture that I displayed there? Anybody? What? Keep going. You're right on. What did you say, Tom? You're on the right track.
It's like, you know, you're just beating them into submission.
Therefore, it has a high physical content. Remember, we talked about moral, mental, and physical. The attrition has a very high physical content. That's the point. You're right on. It's like beating them. That's physical. Okay. With that in mind, then, let's go look at maneuver. Now, these kind of things begin to become important. Ambiguity, ambivalence, the idea is to generate that surprise, try to do it again. And if you're talking about war, you're not talking about fire, you're talking about movement, fire and movement combination, whether you want to call it Cheng-Chi, Naval Sphere, whatever you want. The idea in one hand, you're trying to tie them up so you can display his vulnerabilities and weakness on the other hand. And instead of having measures of success, note I got indications that tend to be qualitative. And the key idea is any phenomenon that suggests inability to adapt to change. As long as you get him in a position where it makes it very difficult for him to adapt. And I'm just giving some examples. Confused disorder, high prisoner count. That's right. When he starts getting all kinds of prisoners, that means he's very confused and disordered. Can't keep up. Let me cite an example here. Many of you people have seen a basketball game. And you see, ever notice when one team starts getting leverage, the other tries to come unglued? You can't measure that. All you know is they're not working together. What do? The first thing? It's called timeout so you can get our act back. You can't measure that. So why do we use targets destroyed in body count? Because we can measure it, we can insert it in the computer. I guess after the bar chart goes up so high, they're supposed to throw the towel in, but they don't. Guderian, when he went through France, another example. He sensed it. He said, my God, I can smell a rock in the French army. Now's the time to go for it. Couldn't measure it. He just, now's the time to really stick it in good and hard. And they did. At least until they got the done. Remember, if you look at a campaign, they were trying to make them go slower than that. Moving the hill, they keep diving right into their system.
Would you consider the Iraqi-Iranian war somewhat like this falling into it?
I haven't looked at that. They're back to Verdun, World War I. You know, they're attrition war. Oh, back into not maneuver, attrition. And they're just, you know, pumping bodies and people and artillery back and forth. But know what we're talking about. You can't measure it, you sense it. Just because you can't measure it doesn't mean it's unimportant. Remember I said that earlier. How do you put friction in a computer? How do you put the inability to keep up into the computer in a mental sense? But by looking at certain events, by what's unfolding, you say, hey, these guys are coming unglued, they're not keeping up. Now we can leverage. Or we can set events up so we can put them in that position so we can leverage. Okay? Now, let's look at essence of maneuver conflict. Create, exploit, magnify these kinds of ambiguity, ambivalence, deception, fast change maneuvers, effort. Note what I got here. Let's define ambiguity. Alternative or competing impression events as they may or may not be. In other words, you want a public number of impressions in a guy's mind. Because he's got to sort that out. What does that do? It generates many non-cooperative centers of gravity, many non-mental cooperative centers of gravity. Slows it down. Makes it more difficult to adapt. Can't keep up. An outgrowth of that ambiguity, ambivalence. starts getting contradictory information, opposing information. He starts vacillating back and forth, indecision. Not only do you slow him down, you paralyze him. Mentally, can't keep up. Mental paralysis. But there's a different form. Deception can be impressions of events that they're not. In any case, note this. Impression of an event or impressions of events that they're not. That means good picture, wrong picture. Well, isn't that nice? Just totally incorrect. What's my point? If you examine ambiguity with deception, ambiguity is confusion and disorder. Deception is a form of order. It's a false order, but it's an order. Now, it turns out, people who are familiar with these things, you can generate ambiguity more rapidly than you generate deception. The reason why you generate confusion and disorder more than you generate order. It's quicker. Not only that, it's less risky. So ambiguity is faster and more risky. On the other hand, if you realize the deception, there's enormous leverage. Yet you read military history, they never talk about ambiguity, they always talk about deception. They just can't say ambiguity. A little hard to understand. And in some of his maneuvers, he was really talking about ambiguity. He never said the word. He kept saying deception. That's not deception. I might add, he's not the only one. So one is less risky, rapid, more rapid, ambiguity. Riskier, takes longer, more living. Let me illustrate some examples to give you a feel. Invasion of North Africa, 1942. We got on there pretty easy, virtually a free ride in. Afterward, critique the deception campaign. They said, well, it really wasn't a success of deception. The deception campaign didn't work. Instead, it was a success of security. Of course, that can cover anything. But then when you read into the writing, the Germans had the right information. They had all kinds of information, some right and some wrong. They couldn't sort it out. It was a success of ambiguity, and we couldn't even say it. Now, I've illustrated something there. Did anybody understand what I illustrated? How many times in the past have you seen in the paper or official pronouncements or documents where they say, oh, we had the information of what was going to happen after the operation. What they didn't tell us the information they had that they also thought was going to happen wasn't incorrect. How many times have you seen in the paper they tell us, say, oh, we had it, CIA, oh, goddamn, we knew it. We had that information. But they didn't tell you the other information they had that didn't agree with that, and they weren't sure what was right and what was wrong. So they were correct. They said they had the right information, but they failed to tell you those other information they had that wasn't right, because they weren't sure what was right. So this is the kind of thing we're talking about. Another example, the invasion of Italy after Sicily. Remember, we didn't intend to invade Italy. We were exploiting an existing situation. We were successful in Sicily there, fall of the Mussolini government, etc. We said, hey, boy, let's exploit this situation. The whole thing turned into a fiasco. We had all kinds of problems. Salerno, Anzio, etc. So once again, they said, why? They said, how come we couldn't get a good deception campaign going? And they said, hey, we didn't have time to set up a deception campaign. Which is correct, it takes time. Well, you can't stop the war to set up a deception campaign. You have to exploit an existing situation, and that's the time to use ambiguity. When you get a blitzkrieg going, you may have deception to start it. Once it goes, you're actually moving on ambiguity. The other guy can't keep up. One more example before I go on. The invasion of Normandy. Beautiful deception campaign. We had the Germans believing we were going to go into Pas-de-Calais. Had them convinced we were going to go into Pas-de-Calais. For over 30 days, even when we were after the beach, all those ships and troops going in, I said, boy, the main effort's really coming elsewhere. Damn good thing, because we still had a hard time. That was extraordinary. But remember, we set that up many months ahead of time to get that image in their minds. They couldn't shake it. Corporately, they couldn't, even though some of them knew that it was the wrong image, corporately, they were unable to shake that image. Okay, so here you're generating many non-cooperative mental centers of gravity in order to slow them down so they can't go. Here you give them Christ, you've got a good picture, wrong picture, doing exactly the wrong thing. If you can get away with it. Of course, they find out, boy, they read through the deception, you're in deep trouble. Fast transit, not only quick, we're irregular. In other words, you can not only shift gears, but they also can't get an image of what's going on. Your effort. The idea is to punch into those parts, allow them to retain their organic wholeness. Hit those connections on them to retain their wholeness so you can pull them apart. We talked about that earlier. So if you pull all those things together, here's your payoff. You're trying to disorient. Deliberately generate a mismatch between what he sees and that which he must react or adapt to. Key word, mismatch. That's disorientation. So if you think about that, if that's the way you define disorientation, now you can redefine surprise. Surprise is nothing more than a form of disorientation. It's not defined that way in dictionaries or textbooks, but it's nothing more than a form of disorientation. And it's usually generated by perceiving extreme change over a short period of time. Perceiving, I didn't say it's done that way. In other words, how many times in your life you've seen something go on, all of a sudden you realize it's been going on for a long time, and oh my God. Walk. Or it can be done because it's quick, or a combination. So you can generate this with ambiguity, deception, etc., or any combination by perceiving. And shock is nothing more than what you call a paralyzing state of disorientation. It's so awesome, it's paralyzed. You can't react, you can't adapt. So in that sense, shock is what I call a hard form of surprise. And disrupt, state of being split apart, broken up, or torn asunder. In other words, generate the remaining non-12% of gravity. So here are these things you're doing. Here's the payoff. There's your aim. Once again, natural fallout, natural consequence. Now let's ask ourselves a question. Surprise and shock are a form of disorientation. Why not just remove them from the board and only use disorientation and disruption? Might want to do that, but then again, let's be careful before we jump into the bag. Let's examine surprise and shock a bit more before we make that decision. And here's a note directed toward that. It can represent overload beyond one's immediate ability to respond or adapt. In other words, when you're surprised, in a sense, you're overloaded, even if it's for a short period of time. So surprise and shock, in other sense, is exhibiting overload. Well, if that's the case, let's reset up. And here's basically what we're trying to do. We're trying to do these things. We're trying to disorient the guy, disrupt the guy, and we're trying to overload him. So he can't cope. Note that a woke or threatening event surface beyond one's mental or physical capacity to adapt or endure. Think about your own life. There's times when sometimes a lot of things happen, but you're having a hard time with that. Now, go for it. Or you try to back off, and people usually let you off the hook. What if they don't? You're in deep trouble. And of course, you can think of the aim this way, or you can think of it that way. But now look at that chart. What's the highest content there? That has a high mental content. Attrition has a high physical content. Maneuver has a high mental content. Look at it. See? I think it's awesome. High mental content. You see, most often you see in the newspaper talking about maneuvers about troops going down this highway or that. You don't get the whole thing. You got to bring in the mental aspect. You don't dislocate a mind, you disorient. And when a guy's mentally disoriented, is he coping with the situation or he's isolated from it? So you've got mental isolation. Okay? With that, let's go into the moral part. An aspect of it. Like I said, I spent a lot of time with General Ball, somewhere in 1981. In any case, his theme, note this, no recipes for organization, communication, tactical leadership. No recipe, no scheme. In other words, he wants to be adaptable and unpredictable. People want to talk about flying, he wouldn't even, he wants to wide freedom for subordinates to exercise, yet harmonized within the intent of superior command. Matter of fact, we had a meeting up in one of the assistant secretary's office. This guy kept saying, well, how do you tell the guys to look both sides? You tell them how to do anything. We just lay down a mission. Once it's agreed upon, he determines how it's going to be carried out. I go do something else. I said, well, how do you know he's going to do it your way? He said, why is that important? As long as he gets the job done. He said, he probably will do it different. But he is different than I am. Very revealing in how our people want everybody, you know, cookie cutter. They want everybody stamped out the same way. Heavy reliance upon moral instead of material security is basis for cohesion and open success. And note this, must create a bond based upon trust, not mistrust. You have to bring that up. Trust, not mistrust. Now, when you start talking about trust and mistrust, you're getting to what? Now, when you think of trust and mistrust, now you're getting to the moral dimension. That's a moral dimension. Ethical dimension. He says, how is this atmosphere achieved? Only one way, by example. Physical agility, physical energy, mental agility, and moral authority. And if you can demonstrate those kinds of things, then you can get people to cooperate and take those initiatives. What is the price? No free lunch in this game. Courage to share danger and discomfort at the front. In other words, you're going to be able to share those same goddamn problems other people share. Then they know you understand. Willingness to support and promote even unconventional and difficult supporters. They can do these kinds, accept danger, demonstrate initiative, take risks, etc. As a matter of fact, in the German equivalent to what we call our OER, does everybody know what OER means? Officers' Effectiveness Report. Their equivalent, their system, up at least to World War II. They had a statement in there, a code word they put in there, this officer is a difficult subordinate. You know what that meant? Promote early. And our system is two. And he explains it very well. He said, the reason why is if you've got a guy that has these characteristics, that means he's going to be a pain in the rear to a superior. Automatic. Because he's got a different idea. The guy, gee, you know. It's different. You're doing it different. We didn't do it that way. You've heard people say it. So what? The question is, has it been thought through? Can it be done in that kind? And is it within your moral culture? If you answered yes to that, then what's all this nonsense? And you can't violate your culture either, but as long as within, say, what's all this garbage about? Also, dedication, resolve to face a master that's started to apply in the face of traditional solution, and we'll be able to think of it a different way. Instead of having the so-called definitive or elegant solution, or that one we've used, the standard solution for the last 10 years. And the benefit, internal simplicity that permits rapid adaptability. You say, my God, that's a strange one, but it really isn't. If you've done all this, you forge those implicit connections or bonds one with the other. You have those shared images, so you can tell somebody to do something, and it's done. With that, instead of having these long, detailed orders, new instructions, all that. It's inherent. Now here's the chart in a book that I read, or actually listed out a book that I ran through about 2 or 3 weeks after I talked to Bach, so it really caused these passages to leap out at me, these 3 pages, 124 and 61. The underlines are mine, so I'll let you read it and I'll comment. The key point I'm trying to make, if you look at these things that underline, they're all related to one another very directly, even when they're occurring at the time. So let's build upon that relationship. And so if we look and start pulling some things together, some insights that we pull up relative to all of the false ideas. All I'm saying is these ideas are related to one another. I showed the previous chart. If we look at those comments, 124, 160, 165, they suggest that moral effects are related to the menace posed by the Zeppelin and the uncertainty associated with not knowing what to expect or how to deal with it. Remember, they've never experienced that before. It's a menace, they don't know how to deal with it. So for a first cut, we can say, in some sense, moral effects must be related to menace and uncertainty. It's a way of thinking about it, a way. But it seems to leave some things out. In other words, we don't bring in the collective aspect, the collective moral strength. Or we will point out here, the idea of trust. Remember, Guerrilla commanders, other people have to, they try to generate mistrust. We're all talking about having trust. So if you're living in an environment of conflict, adversarial relationships, these things come together. You have to deal with this. Trust and mistrust. So it really suggests, if you put it all together, that moral strength in some way represents capacity to overcome menace, uncertainty, and mistrust. Menace, uncertainty, and mistrust. So building upon that, we're going to start making some definitions here. This is a way of getting into it. So if we go back to Clausewitz, remember I told you he brought out fear, anxiety, and alienation in a noble counterweight, courage, confidence, and spree. If we tie that in with the moral strength, we make these other definitions: moral victory, moral defeat, moral values, and moral authority. They begin to start leaving out it. We start pasting them together. And of course, the one we're going for is moral authority. Person or body that can give one courage, confidence, and spree to overcome menace, uncertainty, and mistrust. I've got some better ways of talking about that in a minute. I'll do, but I want to go through this right now. In fact, I'm going to come out with some new work that I'm doing some research on mine. But he brings it very much related where I say you can't morally isolate somebody, you have to morally isolate yourself. You really can't. He doesn't. Mentally you can, physically you can, morally he really doesn't himself. You set shape circumstances so it can happen. In a sense he doesn't. Okay, with that in mind, let's pull it together. It's not what I call, at least for a first step, essence of moral conflict. So you're creating, exploit, magnify these things: menace, uncertainty, and mistrust. And the idea, and the aim. That has a very high negative content. So, you know, it's a suspicion that's what I have here. It seems to be called one-sided. So let's see if we can pick up the positive side. It's like Clausewitz has a negative emotional factors, also positive. Let's see if we can pick up the positive stuff. And a way of getting into that is, let's just look at with mistrust. The presence of mistrust implies a rough, loose, and human bond. It suggests harmony in something. We've got to be able to get some kind of harmony so people can build up these bonds of trust. That's one thing. In dealing with uncertainty, you have to have, you can't make things certain. Life just doesn't work that way. You have to be able to be adaptable, deal with that uncertainty. And we have to face menace. You just can't say we're going to be friendly. You have to take initiative. You may be unfriendly. On the other hand, you're able to make it be friendly. So if we paste all these things together, we can modify that chart somewhat and look at it a bit different, what I call both negative and positive factors, or counterweights. So we have menace, uncertainty, mistrust, and counterweights, initiative. Internal drive to think and take action without being urged. Adaptability, power to adjust or change. Harmony, interaction apparently disconnected events or in a connected way. That doesn't mean they're all one-to-one, it's kind of really one-to-one. So then you have both a negative aim and a positive aim. What are moral values? Bring it out. What are values? Anybody, we use the word a lot. Maybe you want to look at that way. It's very important.
Well, I mean, according to your definition, which works real well, moral values are things a group of people would have in common that enable them to have initiative, adaptability, and harmony among each other.
That's one way. I'm taking it deeper. I'm going beyond some, like some word. What are they? You know what they are? Let's say everybody can do anything they wanted to do. There are no constraints. Christ, the thing wouldn't hold together, would it? So moral values, or moral standards, they're constraints on individual behavior so the organic whole can exist. If everybody has freedom of action, you have no organic whole.
Well, supposedly, the
You
moral,
may tell them what to do, but that's a constraint, as well as not tell them what not to do. That tells them they have to operate in a directed way. That's a constraint on their individual behavior, of one kind or another. I'm going to get into it deeply. That doesn't mean it's bad.
supposedly in the absence of all constraints, the moral values are what surface. The moral values are the only thing that keep you together in the absence of all constraints.
But they are what? How do you build up moral values over time because the imprint of your culture and what thou shalt do, what thou shalt not do, or how one will interact with others. So in that sense, a moral value or ethical value is a constraint of one kind or another, how you're going to behave. And that's to allow the group to survive. Think about it. It's not bad, it's good. But in the end, it's some kind of a constraint. You just can't give everybody total freedom of action. The whole thing goes to hell. Whether thou shalt do this, or thou shalt not do this, or thou will act this way, or etc., or however you want to say it, or ethical practices in business, whatever it is. It may not be written down. It makes no difference. Okay, then, a moral value in some sense, then, are standards of behavior, codes of conduct, etc. So if you have moral isolation, what do you have? Now we're going to get down to it. I'm trying to lead you somewhere. When you morally isolate somebody, you really don't. He isolates himself. That's an inability. It's related to the inability of individuals or groups to abide by codes of conduct, standards of behavior, deemed acceptable or essential to others outside. Inability to abide by codes of conduct, standards of behavior, or systems of value deemed acceptable or essential to others outside those individuals or groups. So, the alienation takes place is when you violate those codes of conduct and standards because they're deemed acceptable, because it permits the group to exist, and you alienate yourself. Now, some people do it, they try to get away with it, but once it's surfaced and made visible, they're too. In other words, don't hose your friend. Particularly by trying to cover it up, we find out it gets formed off. Now that doesn't mean it's not going to happen. Sometimes you may do it, and you may not even know you did it. You better correct it. Most of these things are corrected because they are. You're going to make mistakes. Of course, different cultures are going to have their standards and behavior might be different. These are very important. If you really don't want to make something, he has to do it himself by making those progress. But mentally, you can isolate it. Because what's mental isolation? Inability to do what? Perceive or make sense of what's going on around yourself. So if you can set up the pace of events or cause things to happen, the guy's mentally isolated, he doesn't know what the hell's going on. He's disoriented. Code word disorientation. So now military tends to think mostly, they're cutting lines of communication, that kind of stuff. That's physical isolation. Trying to isolate the guy so he can't get sustenance so he can keep his operations going. That's a material aspect. Then you go mental isolation. Now you get the guy so he's confused, can't keep up, he starts coming unglued, gets demoralized. Now, let's assume you demoralize someone because of mental isolation. Start seeing things are coming unglued. And let's say those bonds between them weren't too strong, where there were some little devious things pretended overlooked. Now, remember what I said? Defeat is an orphan, and victory has 1,000 fathers. Pretty soon everybody's pointing fingers at everybody else. That's when the moral parts of these things begin to show up. Emily was a rat. Right then, John go up and send his rat. Very important. Okay. With that in mind, let's go to the synthesis. for successful operation. In one sense, you have to have some kind of a goal or aim in mind. Plan defeated, action defeated plan, support defeated action, command, you got to glue it all together. So what are we talking about here? Let's start laying it out. What is our goal? In some sense, what you're trying to do is diminish your adversary's freedom of action while improving yours, so that he cannot cope and you can with things that begin to unfold. And so when you cut his lines of communication, when you disorient him to the kind of thing we're talking about, you're really inhibiting his freedom of action. And so your plan, you want to probe to unmask his strengths, weaknesses, and maneuvers. In other words, get right inside his great Sun Tzu. Employ a variety of methods, interweave menace, uncertainty, mistrust of these, tangles of these things. Sever his moral ties, disorient his mental images, etc. Mask, distort, magnify, hour. Sometimes mask, sometimes distort, sometimes magnify. That in turn gives you the ability to select initiative or response that is least expected, whether it be moral, mentally, or physically. That'll permit you to establish in these things, focus the main effort together with other efforts and pursue directions that permit many happen. Doesn't mean you make them all, but you have all kinds of possibilities. He knows you're going to put them in the horns of many dilemmas. Offer many branches and threaten alternative objectives. You can't get a good picture of what's going on. And then to keep that operation going, move along paths of least resistance, right? That allows the paths of least resistance to manifest themselves. You just start exploiting them. Keep pulling the system down further. Now here's an interesting one. Exploit rather than disrupt or destroy those differences or those features in his system that interfere with his ability to cope with unfolding challenges. Let me give you an example, particularly in guerrilla warfare. Guerrillas, I'm referring to this one right here, guerrillas, if you have like a corrupt province chief, don't really like to take them out. In a second. Because they take out the corrupt province chief and put someone in there good, then they don't have their basis for the guerrilla movement. So by having a corrupt province chief, they can use that as a recruitment effort to build up their own guerrilla cadre. So they don't want to take that out, unless it's really bad and the people really demand it. Instead, they'll lever that system, build up their own movement. Of course, after they've got it made, then they'll take them out and probably execute them. But not at the time when they're using them as a rallying point to build up their own efforts. You see what I'm getting at there? Okay, and then subvert, disorient, or disrupt those things allow him to keep his own act together. Permit him to keep his illusion. The idea is to dismember him, isolate him from offense. And the action. More conspicuous, more regular. That gives you the basis for initiatives to be guided into his system, exploit his vulnerabilities. Your support, mobile communications, essential logistics, maintain cohesion, maintain pace of operation, cohesion, overall effort. And command, I call this command of the light. Command of the light touch. As a matter of fact, these ideas I have here are very, very similar to the ones Mao has. Very similar to where I have for me. How many people read on his On Guerrilla Warfare? Anybody? Mao? The last two, in fact, the last 2 or 3 pages of the book we talked about it. I haven't got you. Pardon? Pardon? No.
You finally stumped us on one.
Mao's a film, man.
Yeah.
Very interesting. Agreed. Okay. Now I want to draw your attention to something. I want to draw your attention to the plan and action here. I want to play with you. And what we're suggesting by that plan and action, these statements that we talked in the previous chart, one, we're trying to penetrate his system, mask our system against his penetration. We're trying to create a variety of impressions of what is occurring and what is about to occur, so we can't keep up with it. Generate mismatch between what seems to be and what is. In other words, cause him to do the wrong things. And also push him beyond his ability to adapt. In other words,